I'd like to start with a short, brief personal remark. The Twitter storm that has been mentioned periodically, I was in the middle of, and certainly felt very passionately about the issue, about gender representation in public discourse, and still feel passionately about the issue. But what I wanted to say to Joe and to his team here is my very sincere and warm thanks for your generosity, not only in the initial invitation, but more particularly your generosity in terms of your response. Because I'm sure it was a traumatic and difficult time for you and the staff. But nonetheless, the honesty and the forthrightness, if that's a word, with which you dealt with it, you acknowledged it, you dealt with it, and you did things to make a change. And I think there's more changes that are needed. I think there are more changes, as our chair has said, that need to bring everyone into a room when we discuss public policy. But an important start has been made, I think, here at MacGill. I also think it's a very obvious testament to the place of MacGill that a conversation on a modest summer school in Glenties, County Donegal, would capture national headlines in the way that it did. It just speaks to the centrality of this conversation in terms of our public life. And so again, my thanks and my congratulations to you. As Monty Python would say, and now for something completely different, this is a dangerous time. Dangerous not because there are security challenges facing Europe. We have always had security challenges facing Europe. But it's dangerous because the architecture that Europe has relied on to face those threats is itself now under attack, both from outside Europe and from inside Europe. What I want to do today is briefly to review those threats and to suggest how I think Irish policy needs to respond if the state is to contribute more effectively to its own security and defence. And I think we'll all acknowledge that the security threats themselves are very self-evident and quite clear. We have arcs of instability to our south and to our east, giving rise to the gravest of humanitarian and security crises. We have the ongoing threat of terrorism. We have cyber threats from state and from non-state actors. We have the attempted subversion of democratic systems across Europe, overseas funding of extremist parties, and tampering with electoral processes. There are threats that derive from the proliferation of weapons, conventional weapons which feed disputes across the globe, particularly in Africa, the use of chemical weapons in Syria, and the ongoing dangers posed by the proliferation of nuclear weapons. We have unresolved and ongoing conflicts across Europe, from the Balkans to Cyprus to Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. And then, of course, we have Russia's invasion, occupation, and annexation of part of Ukraine, and their ongoing efforts to destabilize eastern Ukraine. That's a long list. But traditionally, European states could rely on a mix of institutions and structures to address such security threats. And this is a real alphabet soup of organizations. The European Union, the UN, NATO, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, the Council of Europe in some respects, and a myriad of bilateral, minilateral, and other multilateral frameworks. And it was from this network that European states could, individually and in concert, select from among those institutions to address whatever threat was preeminent at whatever particular time. The network itself rebalanced and adjusted over time, depending on the kinds of threats that were most evident. NATO, for example, predominated during the Cold War in face of the Soviet threat. The OSCE and the European Union came to renewed prominence after the end of the Cold War as the Soviet military threat diminished and we began to look towards more collective security instruments and more collaborative security efforts. Each institution itself also adapted over time. NATO developed a collective security role and an out-of-area capacity at the end of the Cold War, while the European Union, faced with its own abject failures in the Balkans and elsewhere, developed a security and defence policy aimed at making a more effective peacekeeping contribution internationally. Sometimes there were rows, even bitter ones, such as over a policy towards Iraq, the Iraq invasion in 2003 and the attacks on Libya in 2011. And of course, there were always rows about money. Throughout, the key military pillar in this framework, the key institution, defence institution in this pillar, including more than 24 European states, was NATO. NATO was premised on the understanding of a North American, principally US, commitment to European security and defense. And NATO's effectiveness, in turn, was constructed on three pillars. First, the text of the 1949 Washington Treaty, where Article 5 provides that the Allies declare that, quote, an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. That article has only been invoked once in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks on the United States. The second pillar to NATO's effectiveness was an integrated command structure for Allied military forces in Europe, and that included the forward placement of tens of thousands of US troops in Europe, literally as a human tripwire. And the third element to NATO's perceived effectiveness was the political credibility of the US government. Cue laughter. That credibility was based on a constant and reinforced restatement of the US commitment to the defense of Europe, that the US would stand by its alliance commitments. Now, the text of Article 5 is still there in black and white. The US troops are still there, about 60,000 of them, literally as a human tripwire in Europe. But the political context has changed enormously. It's now obvious to me that based on the actions, statements, and what we know of the mindset of the US president, that a clear US political commitment to NATO is missing. The US president views NATO as a transaction. Europeans pay cash for US defense. He has framed it in these specific terms: no cash, no defense. 2 weeks ago, he went further and said that unless the European allies doubled their defense spending, the US, and I quote, would look elsewhere. In effect, he understands NATO to be some kind of racketeering operation, a mafia-style structure where Europeans pay protection money. Now, that's bad for NATO, but it gets worse. 2 weeks ago, the US president doubled down on his evident animosity to the very principle underpinning NATO, that of mutual defense. He told one of his staunchest US media supporters in an interview that he, too, questioned why the US should defend small European countries, in part because they might, quote, drag the US into war. But he complained, that's the way it was, that's the way it was set up. I can't do anything about it. All I can do is get more cash. The president's antipathy to the core value of NATO's collective defense, which he clearly doesn't even understand, is clearly visible. And for many in Europe, this is a very new and real threat. What must European states now do if the United States can no longer be viewed as a strong and stable ally? What it has done is given greater urgency to those that insist that Europe must do more toward its own collective defense. A lot has happened, and a lot is happening, and I'm sure we'll hear about that in a moment. There are new structures, there's new money, there are new programs, all of which are dedicated to the further integration and strengthening of collective security and defense in the European Union. But, and this is our question, what can, what should, and what must Ireland do to contribute to its own security in Europe? Now, by reason of geography, history, politics, and culture, Ireland has ploughed its own furrow in terms of security and defence. And regardless of your views on Ireland's traditional policy of military neutrality, that unique heritage has now to be applied in a very different, a very dangerous, and a rapidly changing security situation in Europe. And I think we're threatened in three specific ways. Most obviously, there are the direct threats, from adversaries that either wish to do us harm or through us to do harm to others. The most obvious sources of these threats are from terrorism, post-Brexit instability on this island, and cyber attacks against critical infrastructure networks or on our domestic politics, and I'd watch that space. The second area where we're threatened are indirect threats, which impinge materially on Irish security, such as those that arise from instability or insecurity among Ireland's neighbours and European partners. And here I'm thinking very particularly the Baltic states. But I'd add a third set of threats, what I would refer to as systemic threats, which I think are new and undervalued. What I mean here are threats that undermine or seriously damage international law, governance, and norms, which have been strengthened and developed since the end of the Cold War. Because it's this structure that Ireland, as a military neutral, has always relied upon most heavily. And those threats can arise from authoritarian states, the rise of extremist political forces, and other challenges to human rights and principles of global justice. Now, in no way do I want to suggest or be understood to suggest that Ireland is not making a contribution to its own security and defence. Our defence and security forces are well trained and highly motivated. They are also regularly posted overseas on very difficult missions in support of international security. Our diplomats and other public servants are successfully engaged internationally through the UN, EU, OSCE, and other institutions to work and defend and strengthen international law and justice, particularly in areas like disarmament, development, human rights, and conflict resolution. However, in this new and unstable environment, where our European partners can no longer rely on what they knew as a stable, even if flawed, US partner, we are called upon to do more, to do what we reasonably can to fill the security gap that is opening up for Europe and for ourselves. And I think there's a practical menu of steps which can be taken in this regard, some of which have been identified and some of which you'll be familiar with. First and most obviously, expanding Ireland's diplomatic footprint, both in terms of embassies and consulates, but also in terms of personnel, both their number and their training. Supporting our defence forces more effectively, in terms of better pay and conditions, and developing appropriate structures, especially for the reserve defence forces, and giving all of these forces the equipment with which they need to do their job. We need to set out a roadmap to meet our commitments on development aid funding, so as to contribute substantially to addressing some of the underlying features that give rise to instability and insecurity globally. We need urgently to better regulate and defend our political system and our electoral processes from external attack and being undermined. We need to contribute more meaningfully to security and defence also in Europe itself, at least to the point, and I come back to them, at least to the point at which we can credibly assure our partners like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania that we see their security as inextricably part of our own security. And we also need to strengthen our domestic arrangements so that we can continue to forestall terrorist attacks. So the menu is long, the menu is detailed, and it requires resources and political will. But above all these things, it requires a plan. And this is the core of my argument and where I conclude. As of now, this state has no adequate structure for strategic security planning. None. The elements are there in the defence forces, in An Garda Síochána, in government departments, in civil society, in private sector, even in business. But what is critically missing, although those elements exist, what is critically missing is the structure to bring those elements together, to identify, to categorize, and to prioritize security threats, to then assess what capabilities are required to meet those threats, and then to quantify and apply the necessary resources to develop those capacities to meet those threats, whether those capacities are military, civilian, public, private, or voluntary. In almost every other European state, this task would be assigned to something like a National Security Council, reporting directly to the Oireachtas, to the Cabinet, or to the Taoiseach, actively engaged with national stakeholders and dedicated to the systematic production of regular national security strategies. These would then be the subject of open public debate, transparent, democratic, and often all-party decision-making, as well as effective review, revision, and supervised implementation. This, to my mind, is the critical missing link to strengthen Irish security and to strengthen Ireland's contribution to the security of Europe. Thank you very much.